You can be seated. Our lesson this morning comes from the 23rd chapter of Luke's Gospel, verses 33 through 43, but it doesn't really need an introduction because it's the story of Christ's crucifixion, which I admit is an odd choice for Christ the King Sunday, isn't it? About how our King is ridiculed and despised, beaten and killed in these verses for his people, for all people. And yet, in the midst of all of that, he still asks God to forgive them. On second thought, maybe it's not such a strange choice after all. Here now the words of God's servant, Luke. Now when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified him there with the criminals. And there was one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. And then they cast lots to divide his clothing. Now the people stood by watching, but the leaders, they scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, so let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one. And the soldiers, they mocked him too, coming up and offering to him sour wine and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him saying, This is the King of the Jews. Now, one of the criminals who was hanged there, he kept deriding Jesus and saying to him, Are you not the Messiah? Well, save yourself and us. But the other criminal, he rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God? You are under the same sentence of condemnation. And we have indeed been condemned justly. We are getting just what we deserve for our deeds. But this man, he has done nothing wrong. And turning to Jesus, he said, Jesus, remember me when you go into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, saying, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. There's one like it in every town, I guess. You know, a place where the pall of death hangs so thick in the air, you worry you might breathe it in as if it were a disease. It's the sort of place you avoid, like, let's say, fish taco day in the cafeteria at school when you're a kid, which is to say, you avoid it like the plague. Why? Because it's terrifying. That's why. And I don't know where that place is in LJ, but back home, well, it was the cemetery at Oak Grove. You see, for the adults, well, it was just another cemetery, a place where we've been burying our loved ones since they dug the very first grave for Mr. G.P. Hammerly way back in 1865. But kids like me and Casey, we knew better than that. Because it was a place from which the dead would sometimes walk right back into our world and treat it as if it was their own. Like legend had it that come evening, on November 8th every year, the Reverend William T. McKnight, the very first pastor of the Iuka Methodist Episcopal Church South, he would leave his grave in Oak Grove, walk through town to our church, and preach his inaugural sermon from our pulpit one more time. one story. Because there were others. About ghosts of Confederate soldiers looking for lost belongings, their lanterns gently bobbing up and down in the dark. And stories about people murdered in cold blood who were still trying to tell their loved ones just who it was who had killed them. But the worst story of all was about how Miss Dorothy Jones, who died in 1928 without any kids, would hang around just outside the cemetery entrance on Halloween, long enough to grab any unsuspecting trick-or-treaters who just so happened to be walking her way. In fact, my friend Chris Southwood, he told me he just barely made it out alive one year when he'd run ahead of his dad trying to get to as many houses as possible before it got too late. Says if it hadn't been for those 2 years worth of karate lessons at the dojo in the next town over, not so sure he would have made it. And so, needless to say, Oak Grove, for us kids, was the sort of place you walked past with your head down, your eyes on your shoes, and with as much distance between it and you as you could get. And honestly, that's the way I've always thought about the place that's mentioned in our lesson this morning. You know, Golgotha, Cranion, Calvary, whatever you call it, meaning skull. I thought about it as though it was this kind of place which you put your head down, you kept your distance, and you walked by just as quickly as you could because it was just eerie, maybe even haunted. After all, St. Jerome, one of the early church fathers, said it was called the place of the skull precisely because skulls of executed prisoners were said to have been littered all over the hillside. So don't tell me there's not a ghost or two wandering around a place like that, because how could there not? The thing is, though, in the last couple of years, I've come to find out that the place of the skull isn't so much like Oak Grove Cemetery as it is our very own diagnostic and classification state prison in Butts County, Georgia. Which means that one, Golgotha, the place of the skull, well, surprise, surprise, it's owned by the state, by the government, by Rome. And what that means is that everything that happens in our lesson this morning, it is political. So first things first, you see, crucifixion, it's not the kind of thing that happens to mere criminals. You only get crucified by the Romans if you're an enemy of the state. Which means that the Greek word karakoulos, that's used to describe the two men who are hanging on either side of Jesus, which gets translated as criminal in my NRSV Bible, it's not right. The King James Version that some of you may have actually gets it right. It's the better translation, in my opinion. Malefactors, it calls them, or treasoners in some. Which means that all the things that are happening in our lesson this morning, they're all done so that Rome can tell the world, you want to go against the government? Fine. Go ahead. But we can guarantee you that this is what happens when you do. And so when Jesus, Simon of Cyrene, and others are led away from Pilate after he bangs his gavel and announces the final verdict in verse 26, political statement. When Jesus and the crowds get to the place that is called the skull and they strip Jesus bare and they nail him to the cross, that's a political statement. And when they finally raise him up in between two malefactors, two karkoulos, it's the most political statement of all. We're at the end of it, though. But it's not. Because what happens next? Well, it's the taunts. You see, first it's from the leaders who scoff at him. You know what they say. Hey, you saved others. So why not save yourself? If you are the Messiah, that is. And then the soldiers, they join in too. Come on, King of the Jews. Do it. I dare you. Come down. They've even put one of those political campaign signs right above Jesus' head. Not so very unlike the ones I've seen plastered on so many folks' cars in Atlanta. Only instead of Donald Trump or Clinton for prison 2016, this one's another mocking sign. King of the Jews, 30 to 33 AD. It's all mockery. Nobody thinks he's King of the Jews. They don't mean it. They just want to taunt him and his followers. And I can just see it now, The crowd's there yelling at him. I wonder if it looks like the riots we're having in some places now. Are things on fire? Are camels and donkeys burning? Everybody marching with swords and knives, just itching to use them. Are there people fighting as they cry out, "Crucify him, crucify him"? Honestly, I don't know. What I do know, though, is that they are so distracted by their efforts to make this political statement, to protect themselves, that they don't notice what is actually happening. That evil has slipped in, and it is having its merry little way. It's like a virus, If you were part of our Bible study on Mark in August, then you may have heard Miss Kim, our accompanist, and I'll give one of the best descriptions of evil I've ever heard. Evil is a contagion, infecting the masses, she said, and nobody goes untouched. I mean, nobody. And I'd say she's right. Nobody goes untouched. I mean, just look at the criminal hanging to one side of Jesus. He is dying, for crying out loud. But even though he is dying, verse 39 tells us that he joins in the mockery anyway. He derides Jesus. Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself. Save us. What are you waiting for? I guess it's not all that surprising, though. It's just what evil does, isn't it? It gets you. Even when you're scared and hurting, even when you're about to die, and there's no way out, evil still tries to work its way in and take over. So crucify him, the crowd shout. And so caught up are they in their politics that they don't see before them the only real king that the world has ever seen. And I hate to say it. Really, I do, but it looks like the same thing has happened to us this year. Because if you don't think evil's worked its way into our political process this time around, then I guess you just haven't been paying attention. I mean, look at the way we've taunted one another. Others that Jesus Christ came to save just as much as me and you. Folks I've heard taunting Republicans at school, call them a bunch of uneducated bigots. But then others taunting Democrats, a bunch of dadgum demo-rats, I've heard people say. And we've all done it. And all under the guise of protecting the nation. Both sides, the country can't take 4 years of Trump. Or we'd be a bunch of dadgum socialists if Hillary had gotten in. And our government, our media, they love it. They count on it. They count on us being so distracted, making our own political statement, that we will not see what is happening. September 30th, 2015. And right in the middle of a big campaign season for both parties. A woman named Kelly Gissendaner was executed at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson, Georgia. You see, on a cold day in February in 1997, report goes that Gissendiner and this man named Gregory Owens, they waited for her husband to get home from work one day. And when he did, Owens forced him back into the car at knife point. And then leading him into this wooded area just outside Gwinnett County, Owens killed him while Gissendiner set fire to the evidence. And it was just awful. And in the end, Gissendiner, she ended up on death row. Maybe you heard that story. What you probably didn't hear, though, was about how she converted to Christianity while she was locked up. Yep, genuine born-again Christian. In fact, she ended up even getting a certificate in theological studies from the very same seminary yours truly attends right now. And if all that wasn't enough, story goes that she started ministering to women inside the prison. Some say she helped them turn their lives around, and others, they even say that Gissendiner prevented them from committing suicide, whispering to them in the night through the air vents about God's love and the way that Jesus Christ, our Lord, died for them just as much as anybody else. All that, though, and you know what happened? The state killed her anyway. And where was the United Methodist Church? Sure, there were some Methodists protesting, others writing state representatives to get that sentence repealed, but not enough to matter, apparently. Which is surprising since, and I quote from the United Methodist Book of Discipline, "We, the United Methodist Church, oppose the death penalty and urge its elimination from criminal codes since all possibility of change in a person's life ends as a result." Were the people of the UMC too busy supporting one party or another instead? I guess we have to decide for ourselves. I hear over and over that the church actually needs to be more political. Preacher, it needs to be more political, people say to me at school. They say it to me in town when I work in places. Even members of my family. Be more political. But what they really mean when they say that to me is that they want the church to support their candidate or be on their side. But that's not the church being political. It's just the church choosing sides. When the church is political, we're writing our state representatives to make sure that the death penalty doesn't happen. Because life and death belong to God and not the government. When the church is political, we're on the phone trying to make sure that the country knows we're not going to shut up about our 120,000 veterans who still haven't received care that they deserve from the VA. That's when the church is political. Ultimately, when the church is political, its voice cries out along with the criminal on Jesus' other side and says in front of the state and in front of the world, this man has done nothing wrong. This man is the king and not you. So the only question, I guess, that we have left to ask, will our voice join the one of the criminal who recognized the king? God, I hope so. Because if the church's voice drops out of all these conversations, the only voice left is the voice of the government. May it never be so. Amen. Well, as we prepare to depart as the hands and feet of Christ this morning, let's stand and sing together my favorite hymn and Miss Rhonda's least favorite. Miss Rhonda's least favorite.
This is good to you. It's not good.
Lord of the Dance on page 2.